If the phrase "too many cooks in the kitchen spoil the meal" were to be a movie, it would be... Hey guys, my name is Subi, welcome to the channel, and I'm going to be talking to you about my experience watching Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the older version, and then right after watching the new Snow White, and my thoughts about both and the differences between them. Now, before we get started, I do want to say that if you are mad that Snow White isn't an Aryan princess like you wanted, this is not the channel for you, I am not the person for you, neither is this the review for you. This video is not going to be like the multiple videos made by mainly racist, white, middle-aged men who were never going to be the demographic of a princess movie, even if it was done well. What do they know about princess movies? Have they watched Mirror Mirror or Ella Enchanted? I didn't think so. Instead, this is going to be a review made by someone who enjoys princess movies and girly entertainment in general, and will be more fair in my assessment rather than someone who's just mad that Snow White isn't white enough. Also, the people who are arguing that her being pale as snow was integral to the plot have not watched the original film, because the only reason it's mentioned that she's pale as snow is because that was the beauty standard at the time. There's no intrinsic purpose for her to be white as snow and can easily be retconned. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get started. The 1937 movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs starts off by opening of a magical storybook that contains the story of a girl named Snow White, who is forced to become a scullery maid because her stepmother, the evil queen, hates her because she's beautiful. Every day, the evil queen goes to a magic mirror that she has and asks it the question, who's the fairest of them all? And every time it answers her, which pleases her until one day it answers Snow White. We see Snow White working as a scullery maid in rags and hear her singing I'm Wishing when she meets upon a prince who happens to fall in love with her at first sight. The evil queen, who has a magic mirror, goes to it and asks after seeing this, who's the fairest of them all? To which the mirror replies, Snow White. The queen, in her jealous rage, orders a huntsman to take the young princess outside the gates and to kill her. And as proof, she asks the huntsman to bring Snow's heart to her. The huntsman can't bear to kill Snow and instead tells her to flee into the forest, and to the evil queen he brings her a pig's heart. Snow White runs frightened into the dark forest and she meets some friendly animals who help her to a cottage. She finds no one inside the cottage but finds little beds and assumes that the home is for 7 orphan children. She then decides, with the help of her little animals, that she's going to cook and clean in the hopes that when the little children return, that they might agree to let her stay at the cabin for a little bit. Then we are introduced to the 7 dwarves, and truthfully, only 3 of them are really necessary for the story, but they come in a package. The dwarves sing their famous hi ho song, and they go back home only to find that the lights are on, the stove is cooking with delicious food, and the entire place is tidy, which is unusual for them. They automatically suspect an intruder and find Snow White, who, after exhausted from cleaning, ended up going to sleep in their beds. The dwarf Doc ends up taking a liking to Snow and wants to have her stay there to keep her safe, while Grumpy does not like her, and honestly, he gives a bit of a misogynistic vibe, which is funny because I don't think people remember this part. Because the rest of the dwarves, besides Grumpy, like Snow, they decide to keep her there, and as she's about to serve supper to them, there's a comedic scene and song where the rest of the dwarves are forced to wash up for the very first time, and they sing about how to properly clean up. Clearly, that scene was made for kids, and there's a couple other scenes like it where it's pretty obvious that this is a movie made for children. Afterwards, there's another scene of the dwarves and Snow White just having fun and learning to live with one another. As Snow White is getting closer to the dwarves except for Grumpy, who's still a bit hesitant about her, the evil queen finds out that the heart she was given was actually a pig's heart, and Snow White is actually alive. She then disguises herself as an old woman and creates a poisoned apple, which would put Snow White into a deep sleep where everyone would think that she was dead. The evil queen believed that the illusion of death would make the dwarves bury her after she had quote-unquote died, and then they would essentially bury her alive, which is honestly pretty dark when you think about it. She wanted Snow to be buried alive by the people who had shown her kindness. The next day, as the dwarves are about to leave for work, they tell Snow to be wary of strangers and don't open the door. Basically all the things my parents told me. The old woman approaches Snow White with an apple, and Snow White, being ever so trusting, takes it and falls into a deathly sleep. The forest animals try to get the dwarves to go to the cabin as soon as possible because they sense the danger, but they don't get there in time. But they do see the evil queen and try to chase her. As they try to get her, the evil queen rushes to a cliffside, and while trying to knock the boulder to crush the dwarves, she ends up slipping and falling to her death. The dwarves then go back to the cabin to discover Snow White's lifeless body and are heartbroken in a beautiful scene, which was my favorite scene from the entire movie, where all the animals, the dwarves, and especially Grumpy is seen sobbing because of Snow White's death. The end. Actually, no, it's not. But the story truly felt complete at that moment. It seemed like the ending that they had instead was a bit of an add-on. We are then told through the storybook that the dwarves, instead of burying Snow White, put her in a glass coffin because she was so beautiful, and her prince from before was searching the countryside to find her, and does, and decides to kiss her for the last time as a goodbye, and instead she wakes up from true love's kiss. Then Snow and her prince ride off into the sunset into his castle so that she can have her happily ever after. Overall, after finishing this story, I would have to say it's not this great fantastical movie, and I do think that nostalgia has somewhat clouded people's opinions of this movie, because compared to many stories that we have today, and even back then, it's not particularly spectacular. But for the time, it was the first animated movie that was also feature length. Do I think that if a similar story to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs were to come out in 2025 that it would have the same success that it did back then? Absolutely not. But for the time, it was a great innovation, and I understand why it was so popular. The second thing is that it is clearly aimed for kids. It's very simplistic, it's just trying to tell a story from A to Z, and there are moments where you can clearly see the intended audience, especially with the song about washing up, and also with Snow's character being very Dora the Explorer-esque. A lot of her dialogue is explaining the things that are on scene in very child-specific ways. This is a broom. This is a candle. This is a chair. And again, with the song that was like, you have to rub-a-dub-dub to keep clean. Those were all lessons that were important for kids, and that's why they were added in. It clearly wasn't trying to extrapolate on some of the story plots, and they just wanted to wrap up everything in a nice way, which is why they kind of shoehorned in the ending, if I'm honest. But the animation is truly so stunning. But I always find 2D animation to be beautiful and something that if you have the option to see on a big screen, to almost always take it. Especially because you can see different animation techniques exemplified in the film, such as using smear frames. I have to commend the movie on being very focused on its plot points, which makes sense given the fact that it's a 2D movie and much of the storyline has to be plot out way in advance to make sure that they're not spending days upon days drawing frames that won't even be used. Exaggerated movements, recognizable characters, and the lack of restraint they had when it came to those scary scenes, even in a children's movie, was what made the movie so refreshing. When thinking about how to transition a movie into the 21st century, there's many different directions that someone could go, because there were a lot of points in the movie that simply weren't expanded on, and it made sense, considering this was their first animated movie, and it had no guarantee of success. But after nearly a century from the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, it makes sense that Disney has more to invest in this movie, both timeline-wise and monetarily. And while many people would argue that it's best to remain faithful to the original source material, I would argue that it doesn't make sense for modern audiences to watch the same movie from 1937. Now, as I finished up the movie, got my keys, and headed to the movie theater to see the new 2025 Snow White movie, I thought of all the different directions that a movie like this could take. And as someone who loves princess remakes and is also very excited for the third season of Bridgerton. Sorry, fourth. I forget the third season even exists because it was so bad. I was super excited to see the direction the movie would take. The story starts off by paying homage to the original by opening up a storybook. It had some cute little animals opening the book up, which I found really adorable. And we're introduced to a kind king and queen who give birth during a snowstorm to a little baby girl, and therefore name her Snow White. I thought this was a perfect way to introduce Snow White and to give an explanation behind her name. We see Snow White and her parents living a wonderful life and treating the villagers well, and everyone's happy. And then we're told that Snow White's mother dies. A new figure comes to the palace, which is her evil stepmother, played by Gadot. Apparently, everyone was bewitched by the evil queen's beauty and believed that her powers were righteous because she was so beautiful. So Snow's father and the woman get married, and she becomes the evil queen. Soon after their marriage, she tells Snow's father that the Southern Kingdom is trying to attack them. She sends Snow's father away and militarizes the entire economy, and everyone's going through sad, hard times because she's basically siphoning out all of the riches of the kingdom for herself. We skip forward and see a full-grown Snow White, who is played by Rachel Zegler, who sings the song Waiting on a Wish, which tells about her wish to become fearless and the person that she always wanted to be. Like in the original, she is forced to become a maid. One day when cleaning, she comes across an intruder in the palace who introduces himself as Jonathan. Jonathan is stealing some food, and he tells her that no one in the castle cares about the people, and she says that the princess does. He tells her basically, what princess? The one we haven't heard from for years, and she watches falls as he tries to make his escape but is caught by the guards. Snow sees the evil queen tell the guards to lock him in the dungeon, but Snow asks for mercy and tells the evil queen that that's what her father would have wanted. The evil queen gets enraged by this and orders that he be locked outside the palace gates and basically be left to the elements to die. However, Snow White sneaks out and unties the rope binding him to save him, and this is all witnessed by the evil queen, who, just like in the original, goes to the magic mirror and asks who is the fairest of them all. And just like in the original, the magic mirror tells the evil queen that Snow White is the fairest of them all. The evil queen orders a huntsman to go into the forest and to bring back Snow White's heart. However, this time, instead of simply being unable to kill Snow White because of humanity, he is unable to kill Snow White because she remembers his name and shows him kindness. Before telling her to leave, he tells Snow White that her father isn't in the Southern Kingdom like the queen has convinced everyone of. Snow flees into the forest, meets some animals, the animals then take her to the cottage, and unlike the original, instead of cooking and cleaning, she simply falls asleep from exhaustion onto the bed. We then cut to the dwarves, who this time are in CGI and honestly look a little bit frightening, as they sing a new version of Hey Ho, this one with interludes that include them saying everyone's name. Does that mean we won't get a second introduction? Of course not. They all go home, find Snow White in their beds, and offer to let Snow White stay there for a night after hearing of her troubles. In the morning, she goes outside after hearing a ruckus and sees that the other dwarves don't take one of the dwarves, Dopey, seriously, and she feels bad for him, so she goes to him when he's alone and says that if he feels unable to communicate via talking, then he should try whistling. He then starts whistling, gains all his confidence back, and we see the start of the new version of Whistle While You Work. After they clean up together, Snow says that she wants to figure out what happened to her father, and the dwarves say that there are a group of bandits in the wood who say they want to bring back the true king. The evil queen finds out that Snow is actually alive and the heart that was given to her was actually just an apple. She, I guess, never decided to look in the box. Snow goes into the forest and meets Jonathan again, and turns out he's the leader of the bandits, and she has a song called Princess Problems where she and Jonathan basically flirt as she tries to convince Jonathan to help her find her father. As she is with Jonathan and the bandits, a group of palace soldiers approach the bandits and tell them to release Snow White to them. Jonathan tells Snow White to run away. Do you hear the thunder? But instead, as the bandits and Jonathan are fighting the soldiers, she doubles back, catches the attention of the soldiers, and has some of her bird friends carry some of her clothes and pretend to be her to lead them astray. And as she's celebrating with Jonathan and the bandits that they got rid of the soldiers, one rogue soldier ends up shooting an arrow towards Snow, but Jonathan steps in and protects her. To try and save Jonathan, they take him to the dwarf's cottage and ask Doc if he really is his namesake and if he can save Jonathan, and turns out, miraculously, he can, even though technically he's not a doctor with no experience, but somehow he manages to save Jonathan. Then they all celebrate a little, and there is a song between Jonathan and Snow where they basically confess their feelings. It honestly does feel a little bit rushed, but also I couldn't see any chemistry between the two. But after their celebration, the bandits and Jonathan decide to go to the castle and confront the queen and tell Snow to stay where she is because it could be unsafe for her. Snow complies. The next day, the evil queen captures Jonathan and the bandits in the dungeon and disguises herself as an old woman to go to Snow. She tells Snow that she knew her father and that he was a very kind man. And Snow White accepts her apple, and before she faints, the evil queen reveals that she killed Snow's father and that he's not in the Southern Kingdom. Jonathan managed to free himself from the chains in the dungeon and go towards Snow, but by that time he's too late and Snow has fallen into a deep sleep. He kisses her and she awakens, ready to fight. She goes to the palace gates and reveals to the public that the evil queen killed her father. The evil queen puts a dagger into Snow White's hands and tells her, can she really be as fearless as she wants if she can't even plunge the dagger into the evil queen's heart? Snow is unable to do so, and as the guards are about to take her away, she calls the names of each of the guards and says that she remembers each and every one of them and the kind people that they are. This act of remembrance and kindness makes the guards switch sides and support Snow instead. And the evil queen, knowing that she's basically lost her support, in anger throws her scepter towards the evil mirror, which ends up being the source of her life, and she fades into dust. And the story ends with Dopey telling that story to a group of villagers. Now, as for my thoughts on the new movie, there are some gripes that I have. I feel like its biggest problem was wanting to be too many things at once, they introduced the bandits, which I feel like were supposed to be a replacement for the dwarves, but somewhere along the line they decided to keep the dwarves and the bandits because there's exactly 7 bandits, 7 dwarves, and you don't really get enough interaction between Snow and the dwarves, or Snow and the bandits, or Snow and Jonathan. I understand that they couldn't just have a random guy swoop in and kiss Snow in this movie because it would seem a bit strange and disjointed because it's meant to be more fleshed out than the original. But the problem with Jonathan is that when he first came onto the screen, when he was stealing food from the castle, I didn't realize that he was supposed to be a love interest. I thought he was supposed to be like the mentor type. And the reason why I thought that is because he looks much older than Snow. And that's because the actor is much older than the actor who plays Snow White. Rachel Zegler is 22 and he is 34. He felt old because he was old. I'm sorry, Disney, but could you not find either a young-looking 30-something-year-old if you really wanted to have someone who is 30-something? Or, you know, you could just have an actor who's close in age to the female lead. There was also the constant character arc that they were pushing that really never went through, which was Snow White trying to become fearless. The problem was we never saw her being fearful in the first place. When she goes into the woods and sees some scary looking pair of eyes, she doesn't cower, she doesn't show that she's someone who's fearful. She automatically shows bravery by going forward to try and touch it, which ends up being a deer. And in one of their first interactions, Snow already lets go of Jonathan, even though that goes against the Queen's order, which is another example of her being fearless. So when she starts singing about wanting to be fearless, there's so many instances where she already has shown she is, so that doesn't feel like much of a character arc. Similarly with the whole Dopey can't speak, but then he learns to whistle, which helps him gain his confidence. We saw only one scene of him being picked on, and it was so slight. And then the very next scene is him discovering confidence. They introduced a problem within the same time frame they solved it, and so the payoff just wasn't there. At the very end, when she goes to confront the evil queen, we get the evil queen talking about how Snow is too kind. Snow is the soft kind of beautiful instead of the harsh kind of beautiful, like a diamond. She's like a rose. She's soft. She can easily wither and die, but the evil queen is forever. They were trying so hard to push the lesson at the end that you don't have to be harsh or hard to rule, but they only showed one other instance of this, and they don't really build upon this to where we get an emotionally satisfying conclusion at the end. The problem with the story is they chose so many different lessons and so many different characters that they wanted to have an arc of some sort for each of the characters, but the problem is they don't have enough time for that, and so they don't build up the problems enough that the audience would care when they're paid off. If I tell you there was once a person who had a problem and then they solved the problem, you would be like, great. Was there something I was supposed to feel with that story? In fact, I don't even remember the bandits' names. Also, Gal Gadot's acting in this was absolutely atrocious because I don't think she knew what her character was supposed to be, whether it was supposed to be this fun-loving villain that's similar to Hades and Descendants, where they love being evil but are funny at the same time, or a truly evil villain. And in every scene, her accent would try to force its way out, and it sounded so awkward. So it would be like her saying a sentence and then ending it with an accent, or starting with an accent, somehow stopping midway, and then starting again at the end. Her acting skills were absolutely atrocious here. And it was honestly a bit painful, if I'm honest. I don't think most people in this story even knew what their character was supposed to be, because it seemed like Disney wanted to go in every single direction. The fun-loving villain versus the truly evil villain. The more spirited heroine versus the more timid heroine who learns that her kindness is her strength. The love interest that wants to support her versus the love interest that's kind of bantering and challenging the princess. And because they couldn't choose what they wanted their characters to be, it ended up being a movie with a little bit of everything, and a little bit of everything is a whole lot of nothing. I saw some sparks of a good movie in there, but the problem was its runtime is only 20 minutes longer than the original, but it has 4 more subplots than the original, and you can't fit a good story and 4 subplots into a similar length as the previous movie without making the story overall suffer. I did want to say there were a lot of people saying that the costuming and the hair were not great. I did not have as much of a problem with the costuming and hair because the hair aspect made sense sense because they explain that the evil queen made Snow cut her hair so that she would be less beautiful. So it makes sense why her bob isn't that great. And it seemed like with the costuming, they really wanted to take inspiration from the original, so they didn't change much, which I didn't love, but you get used to it throughout the movie. Now, what I did have a problem with, and I didn't see many people pointing this out because they probably didn't actually go see the movie, is that throughout the entire movie, Rachel Zegler's lipstick is coming off, and it's an atrocious pink shade that doesn't go with her undertones. Now, you can provide an excuse about the costuming wanting to be more like the original, the hair being forced upon Snow, but explain to me why on earth they gave her the ugliest shade of pink. Did the evil queen also get to choose her makeup? And the problem was, it wasn't even perfectly applied. It was smeared onto most of her lip with a little bit uncovered. And throughout the movie, I couldn't help just being like, who is the makeup artist? Because they need to be fired. There was one part that I really liked about this movie, and that had to be the colors. They were very saturated, very beautiful. I'm so used to seeing muted colors on screen that I just enjoyed seeing some vibrant colors instead. And in the scene where Snow goes to confront the evil queen, she's dressed in a red robe, and the background and everyone else is wearing gray, and I thought that was so pretty, especially with her lip in that scene, because it was one of the only points where her lips were actually properly colored. Overall, I don't think that this is particularly a great movie, nor is it better than the original, because the original had a simplistic plot, yes, but it followed through on that plot well, and it was very focused, while as this movie was very unfocused in what it wanted. And there were so many good directions it could have gone in, and there were hints of greatness in the movie that could have played out more to create a cohesive movie, but because they never chose one path, it ended up being a nothing soup. And because it didn't even have the beautiful animation that made the original Snow White so beloved, it felt short. While the original Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs might not be the spectacular film that people mistake it for because of nostalgia, it has some beautiful moments, especially when it comes to its animation, like the scene of Snow laying in her coffin, as the dwarves surround her, sobbing, as the animals watch through the window, sobbing as well, and as the earth itself is sobbing, it's raining, because of her death. There was no scene like this in the new Snow White. When Dopey's getting picked on, I didn't care because whenever I saw his face, I would feel a bit of disgust at the plasticky nature of it. So yeah, those are my thoughts on both of these movies. Overall, I would say the new movie is meh, and the old movie is good. I wouldn't really bother with seeing the new one, and maybe wait till streaming if you really do want to see it. The only reason you would really want to see this in theaters is if you went on the days where it's like extra cheap, like Tuesdays, I think, it's the movie deals, and you had a little girl who just really wanted to see a princess movie. They're not gonna get a bad takeaway from it because they're probably not gonna get much of a takeaway from it, if I'm honest. Anyways, if you managed to get to the end of this, remember to subscribe. See you sometime.